By the spring of 1937, New York felt tired in a way that didn't show up in photographs, a kind of heaviness in the air that hung between the elevated trains, the river breeze, and the worn stairwells of old apartment buildings, and nowhere felt that tension more quietly than Beekman Hill, that little patch of East Manhattan just inland from the river, full of brownstones stacked shoulder to shoulder, like they were leaning on each other for balance, each one hiding its own private world behind thin walls, creaking floors, and doors that people assumed would keep the city's chaos on the outside where it belonged. The Gideon apartment at 316 East 51st Street, on the 4th floor, was one of those places, an ordinary Manhattan flat in a neighborhood that tried hard to look respectable no matter what storms were brewing across the rest of the city. And inside that apartment lived a small family trying to build something steady. Mary Gideon, separated from her husband Joseph, but still connected to him in complex ways, her older daughter Ethel, who lived elsewhere but visited often, and her younger daughter Veronica, known as Ronnie, who modeled for pulp magazine covers and spent nights navigating the city's clubs, jobs, and ambitions the way so many young women in Manhattan did during the 1930s. And on Easter weekend of that year, that apartment was about to host one of the most unnerving crime scenes the city had seen in decades, a scene that would be examined and re-examined by reporters, detectives, psychiatrists, and neighbors, all trying to understand how a quiet family home became the final stop in the unraveling mind of a man named Robert George Irwin, the artist the tabloids would later call the Mad Sculptor. Irwin didn't drift into New York like a villain from a penny novel. He arrived more like a man who never found the right place to anchor himself, growing up in California under the strict, punishing influence of his father, a preacher whose discipline left emotional bruises long after the sermons ended, and by the time Robert was a teenager, the signs of something wrong, something deep and chemical in his brain, were already there, leading to stays in institutions where doctors tried to treat what they didn't fully understand, labeling him unstable, gifted, unpredictable, and dangerous in ways that didn't always show on the surface. But Irwin had found something he believed could save him: sculpture, discovering he could take clay, soap, stone, anything he could get his hands on, and mold it into forms that felt truer to him than the real world ever did. And as his talent grew, so did the idea that maybe art could quiet the storms in his mind, maybe creation could hold back destruction, maybe shaping something outside himself would keep him from fracturing on the inside. He eventually drifted east, landing in New York, where he ended up renting a room in a boarding house run by Mary Gideon years before the murders, a place buzzing with boarders, gossip, and the restless energy of people trying to start over. And Irwin, lonely and unstable, found himself developing a fixation on Ethel Gideon, the older daughter, a fixation made of delusion more than affection, because while she was kind to him in the polite way many New Yorkers are to strangers who mean no harm, he mistook that for something deeper, spinning it into a fantasy connection that only existed inside his fractured mind. When Ethel moved on with her life, marrying someone else and leaving Irwin behind, that rejection didn't just upset him, it broke something fragile inside him that doctors had already warned about, and instead of letting go, Irwin carried the obsession with him everywhere he went, even as he drifted between institutions again, eventually landing at a theological school upstate, where he tried once more to rebuild himself through religion, only to be expelled in March 1937 for what officials called instability, the same word that had followed him for years like a shadow he couldn't outrun. So Irwin came back to the city with his thoughts circling darker and tighter, and not long after returning, he checked into a cheap room near the Gideon apartment, walking streets he knew too well, pacing the riverbank, imagining confrontations, and replaying old fantasies about Ethel until those fantasies twisted into violent plans. And sometime around Easter weekend, his mind settled on a decision. He was gonna go to the Gideon apartment and face the ghosts he had created in his own head. He walked to 316 East 51st Street, climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, and entered the apartment, though the exact chain of moments inside is something no living witness can confirm, because everything we know comes from physical evidence, neighbors' memories, flight paths he left afterward, and the confessions he later gave to investigators and journalists. Confessions that psychiatrists believed were mostly true but colored by madness and emotional distortion. What is known as this: sometime during March 27th or the early hours of March 28, Mary Gideon was killed first, strangled, and left in a position that made her body difficult to discover at first. Later found under the bed, hidden from immediate view, which meant her death didn't reveal itself the moment people entered the apartment. Frank Burns, the deaf English waiter who rented a room in the Gideon flat, was killed in his sleep, stabbed in his bed, likely never hearing a single footstep before the attack, a man so removed from the events around him that investigators believed he never even woke up. And then there was Veronica, who came home around 3 a.m. after a night out, unlocking her own door with no idea that her family home was already soaked in violence, and sometime shortly after entering, she was strangled as well, her body left on her bed, and this detail, combined with her modeling work, was what the tabloids fixated on the next morning, splashing her pulp magazine photos across front pages, turning a murdered young woman into sensational bait for readers hungry for scandal. When Easter Sunday arrived, Joseph Gideon, Mary's estranged husband, and Ethel came to visit, expecting a quiet family holiday, and they found the apartment door slightly open, something that immediately sent a ripple of unease through them, and as they stepped inside, the sequence of discovery unfolded slowly, painfully. First they found Veronica, lying on her bed, not moving, and the horror of that moment hit before they even realized anyone else was dead, and as Joseph moved through the apartment in shock, he soon discovered Burns in his room, also dead, and only later, after noticing the dog acting strangely, did he look under the bed and find Mary, completing a scene that no one in the family could have imagined when they climbed those stairs earlier that morning. The police swarmed the building, reporters followed close behind, and the story exploded instantly across New York, partly because of the brutality, partly because of Veronica's modeling photos, which the press used shamelessly, and partly because detectives quickly realized the crime scene held a bizarre clue: a small sculpture carved out of soap left in the apartment, something that investigators immediately connected to Robert George Irwin, the former boarder with the unstable mind and the compulsion to sculpt anything he could get his hands on. As detectives dug into Irwin's past, everything aligned: the obsession with Ethel, the history of mental illness, the periods of hospitalization, the years of delusion, the emotional unraveling, and Irwin became the prime suspect almost overnight, launching a nationwide manhunt as he drifted across states under aliases, trying to outrun the city that now knew his name. But the irony was that Irwin wasn't caught by police. He was caught by journalists, because in one of the strangest twists of the case, he contacted a Chicago newspaper and arranged to surrender to them in exchange for money and control over the story, delivering a long confession that would later become part of the official case file, even though psychiatrists warned that some details came from a mind too broken to recount events with perfect clarity. Once he was returned to New York, the legal proceedings began, with famous defense attorney Samuel Leibowitz stepping in, arguing over Irwin's sanity, while psychiatrists debated whether he knew right from wrong that night, whether he acted under delusion, or whether he had crossed the line into a state where choice and reality no longer meant anything. In the end, Irwin pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder, avoiding the death penalty and receiving a sentence of 139 years to life, a number designed to guarantee he would never again walk free. And after a brief time in Sing Sing, doctors declared him legally insane, transferring him to state mental hospitals where he would spend the rest of his life, fading into institutional darkness until his death in 1975. Meanwhile, the apartment at 316 East 52nd Street eventually went back to its quiet existence, rented to new tenants who may or may not have known what had happened there. The floorboards scrubbed clean, the walls repainted, the front door replacing the broken lock that once swung open into horror, and Beekman Hill returned to its sleepy rhythms. And that's the true story of Robert George Irwin, not a supernatural monster, not the vampire the tabloids tried to invent, but a deeply fractured man whose descent into madness collided with a family who never saw him coming, leaving a wound on New York that took decades to fade.